to get to questions. Just
I
give
know.
me.
I'm waiting.
What do you see what African Americans and other minorities have accomplished in the United States that you think would be realistically applied in France?
Should be or would be?
Should be.
Should be. I think that everything related to representation, I think that the real weakness that we have here in France is just existing as, you know, in the image that you have of France. When you think about France, you don't think about someone like me. But when we think about the US, we think about African Americans, for example. So we need to maybe work more about our image and about how we are depicted in everything that is produced from France. So that means having access to funding to make films, to be, you know, in literature, to be journalists, to have, you know, influence in the way you analyze politics, because I've been doing that for 10 years, and I can't name another editorialist of color who goes on the biggest channel, which is very concerning, because that's like, we have many talented journalists of color, but they don't access to the platform that I access to. So I think that there is something like, if you watch an American channel, you see on the set people from many different minorities. But here, if you watch LCE, CNews, or whatever, it's very difficult to have a diverse set. So it's one of the things that we could be inspired from the US, for example.
I think it was Alain Maboncourt who said there are blacks in France, but there's not a black community. Do you agree with that term?
I think that the difference between France and the US is that France officially doesn't recognize the minorities, like whether you're French or you're not, and it's not, minorities are not recognized whether they are cultural, religious, ethnic, racial. It has no status in the law, which means that, for example, French hasn't signed treaties that were mentioning like regional languages, because even if we have many, like in the French mainland, but also in the overseas territories. So that's the difference, is that officially the idea of a community is not even thinkable, and that's the reason why we can't speak of the black people as a community. I would say that there is a community of experience, but the other difference is that even if it's changing now in the US, is that black people in France are very diverse in who they are. Some of them are French, some of them are not. Some have direct African origins. Some are originally from the West Indies or the La Réunion or the French Guiana, which means that even culturally there is a very different. It's very different among the group black. And I think that what has united, it's very sad, but what has united black people in the US was slavery and Jim Crow. We didn't have that in France. We didn't have a time when we were, obliged to stick together. So that means that we didn't have some space to think about think about us as a community, and to even have an elite of lawyers, of doctors, things like that. So that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't say that there is a community. I think that there is a community of treatment, like what unites French black people is that they are seen as black, and so they experience the same thing as being seen and treated as black people.
You mentioned representation. I was thinking of political representation. When you first started, there was just one black député, I think. But in the last election, there were quite a number elected from not just Macron's party, but from the left, I think.
Yes.
And I don't know what the numbers are, I don't know if you know, but there's probably a dozen in the black, and maybe some number of Arabs as well. Is that a sign of progress, or was it just a oddity of the last election?
I think it's one of the factors is that MPs that were elected 2 years ago were younger than the one from the former generation. So in the younger generations, there is more diversity. Most of the MPs of color who were elected were from the party of Macron, La République En Marche. Just one from the left, from La France Insoumise, Daniel Obono, and one from the Socialist Party, Georges Paul-Langevin. Like you have 3 MP who are black women in Paris and one who is Asian. So it's the first time that we have had Asians MPs. I think that I don't know how many there are. I haven't counted this time because there are much more than usually. But at the same time, it's the first time that there is no black person in the government since Nicolas Sarkozy. So it's kind of weird because the government is chosen by the prime minister, so they could have chosen someone. There was Laura Flessel before, who was in charge of sports, and she resigned. So even the minister who is in charge of the overseas territories is white. So that's so it's like I have mixed feelings about that, but it's very a good sign to see many MPs of color, and many of them were not even born in France, so they became French a few years ago, and that's interesting to see people who have been experiencing France as immigrants, right, and who are elected officials now.
One last question before we go to questions. The Gilets Jaunes movement has caused a huge political upheaval, but you see very little involvement of people of color, people from the banlieue. Why is that?
So first of all, I would say that I want to remind that in 2009 there was a social movement in Guadeloupe that was not really taken seriously, but the demands of the people who were in the streets were the same ones as the ones who are carried by the Gilets Jaunes today. And in 2017 there was also a social uprising in Guyana, right, French Guyana, and it was not taken seriously either. So I think that people of color have been trying to voice their concerns several times in the banlieue, in the overseas territories before, and I don't think that they have been heard. And the other thing that I couldn't figure out why there were not many people, especially from the banlieue, in the Gilets Jaunes movement. And I have read an interview from someone who was, I don't remember from which city, but he said, I don't want to be exposed to police brutality, so I don't go there because I know that with my face of, looking as an Arab, I would be the first one arrested and targeted by police brutality. And I can understand that. So that may be one of the reasons, but I'm sure that the reason, and much of the movement of the Gilets Jaunes was also out of Paris, from people from rural neighborhoods where diversity is not at the same level as in urban territories.
Okay, great. Let's open it up to questions. Yes, sir, one there. You want to?
Good evening. Hi. Nice to see you. I used to follow French politics more closely than I do now, but about 20 years ago there was the beginnings of a French anti-discrimination policy. A report was put on the desk of Prime Minister Jospin, and then there was a government agency known as what was it called, the Haute Autorité de lutte contre les discriminations, which functioned for a while, and then it was shut down, and all the people in charge of that policy were sort of put in a closet. What caused that to be such a short-lived policy? There was starting to be something that happened. It wasn't as vigorous, let's say, as affirmative action in the United States because the context is different, but it worked for a while. It was starting to take off, and then it stopped. What happened?
Thank you. So it was la HAD, la Haute Autorité de lutte contre les discriminations. It was created thanks to the EU, because it was an EU law that was transposed into the French law. Because if it wasn't for the EU, we wouldn't have to have such an institution in France. So that's interesting to say that EU pushed anti-discrimination legislation here in France. And then the HAD was transformed and integrated into the Defender of the Rights, the Défenseur des Droits. And it still exists, so it has no binding power, but it can, all the figures that I use for police brutality comes from the Défenseur des
They
droits.
still at least do that. Okay.
Yeah. So it's the head of the Défenseur des droits is Jacques Toubon, and he's really doing a great job about migrants' rights, about minority rights, also in the work.
For a man of the right, he's rather exceptional.
Yeah. Yes, he has changed a lot, and he's very good in that. Like he's been to Calais to see how migrants were treated, and he produced many figures about police brutality, but also about discriminations in the workplace. So I think that the Defender of the Rights is the institution to follow if you want to have an idea about the state of discriminations in France.
There was one tapping over my shoulder here.
Thank you. The question I have is in your discussion about French people looking at America as a country, possibilities and so on. What I heard you say was it's pretty much people who are in positions of the elite in France looking at the elites in the United States. The question I have is, has any of that moved toward French black people who are not in the elite? And how are they reacting to it, or is there still some kind of barrier between them?
It's a very interesting question. I think that many among people who are not in the elite, people who are entrepreneurs, maybe have tried to go on the other side of the Atlantic, but I couldn't tell because I don't have any data about that. I don't really know, but I think that because I answered partly to your question, I think that it's maybe easier if you're not from the elite to be a person of color here in France, because we have a very strong social social, because you're supported as a person who don't have many means to study. For example, you are funded by the government to have healthcare. So if you don't have much money, I think it's easier to be a person of color here. But once you get degrees, maybe it's the time when you think to move, because it's harder to be recognized in the elite. But I think in the US it would have having my parents being immigrants and having money. I don't think it would have been that easy to study. In my case, like I was able to wear glasses. It didn't cost anything to my parents to just take care of me, to take care of my health. So that's something. I think that's the reason why maybe people.
And are there heroes yet? Are there heroes among Africans who have moved from France to the United States to inspire people who are not in the elites or not yet?
You mean French people who live in the US? I'm sure there are, but I can't think.
A few brilliant professors.
Yes,
at Columbia, places like that.
Sports people.
Athletes.
Yeah.
Tony Parker.
Parker, right.
I can name also Omar Sy, who has moved to the US. He's an actor. He's one of the he received the César. He's now in LA.
If you look at moving elsewhere, the head of the Swiss bank, Champ is the guy who said when he first got his first job in the UK, I think, that he would never have that opportunity in France.
Yeah.
And he said that during the interview. So that's the case. I have one back here.